Even an abolition of the independence of monetary policy from politics generally, this book makes no such proposal. Simplifying the Fed's governance merely allows the public to provide more accountability without compromising that crucial insulation of monetary policy from partisan politics. The point is more fundamental about the false basis of the Ulysses Punchbowl approach to Fed independence. Generally, democratic accountability and political insulation are not in the same equilibrium, where more of one necessarily means less of the other. Values and personality matter too. The Fed can have more accountability in which the ways described below, so that the public can understand better when wields the Fed's extraordinary authority by understanding whether the Fed's policymakers' backgrounds and experiences are consistent with one's own policy goals. We can have more accountability and more insulation. Dodd-Frank's reorganization of the Federal Reserve. In the history of the law reviews, it is probably safe to say that there has never been an article more influential institution building than one by Elizabeth Warren, and the co-author proposing what would come to Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Warren began an earlier version of the argument with a compelling logic. It is possible to buy a toaster that has 1 in 5 chance of bursting into flames and burning down your house, she wrote, but it is possible to refinance an existing home with a mortgage that has the same 1 in 5 chance of putting the family out on the street, and that the mortgage won't even carry a disclosure of the fact to the homeowner. Why the discrepancy between our regulation of consumer products and our regulation of consumer finance question is it was not a problem of insufficient laws protecting these abuses, Warren and her co-author argued, but a problem of institutional design. The quantity of law wasn't the distinguishing factor between consumer product safety and consumer financial safety. The quality of the institutions enforcing those laws was. The few issues that fought with political peril as the design and implementation of Warren's ideas as part of the Dodd-Frank Act. Those within the Obama administration who saw the 2008 financial crisis through the lens of systemic risk and financial stability, led by Treasury Secretary Timothy Geithner, viewed the proposal as Warren herself as at the best distraction, at the worst threat to their own reform efforts. Before the passage of the Dodd-Frank Act, Geithner and his senior aides developed an Elizabeth Warren strategy, which was a plan to engage with the firebrand reformer that would render her politically inert. But the Bureau was popular with the Democrats and even the Republican critics of the other parts. With the other critics of the other parts of the Dodd-Frank Act, and eventually received the critical backing of Larry Summers, President Obama's primary economic advisor, in making the case for the CFPB as part of the financial regulatory overhaul. Summers explained an analogy to the president that the airline safety board shouldn't be in charge of protecting the financial visibility of airlines. Neither should the regulators responsible for the health and the financial system to be in charge of the policing abuses in the ways these firms lent money to consumers. Most Republicans, though, hated the proposal and fought hard to prevent it from becoming law. Legislative politics were not on their side. However, the SFPB became a signature component of the Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act, better known as Dodd-Frank Act for its sponsors, Senator Chris Dodd, Representative Barney Frank. In fact, the CFPB was the consumer protection piece of the legislation selling the Dodd-Frank Act. The electorate meant making Warren's CFPB a centerpiece of the reform. Republicans were not deterred by the passage of the legislation and publicly threatened to block Elizabeth Warren from most Democrats' favored candidate, or even anyone else to lead the new bureau. Interestingly, the most common public critiques were not some conservative and libertarian scholars have certainly made that case. Republicans refused to confirm a director because they opposed the Bureau's institutional design, specifically objecting both to the Bureau's funding outside of congressional appropriations and to its supervision in a single director. Rather than multi-member commission, this impasse even led to something of the constitutional crisis resolved only by Supreme Court and the invocation of the so-called nuclear option that eliminated the Senate's filibuster for most presidential appointments. What does this debate have to do with the Federal Reserve and the need to simplify its governance? This book has nothing to say about the benefits or costs of the consumer financial protection laws, either as they existed before Dodd-Frank or as they expanded thereafter from the perspective of institutional design. However, this kind of governance reform is exactly what we should hope to see. Previously, most of the consumer protection laws came under the bailiwick of the Federal Reserve. As a result, there was no clean way for public oversight of the consumer protection function. The Fed had become a jumble of activity, with monetary policy receiving the most attention in the political process. Consumer financial protection was largely ignored. The reality is why. Whatever the virtues of vices... Whatever the virtues of vices of substantive consumer protection laws, hiving off those functions into a separate politically accountable bureau is exactly the right approach to resolving the thorny problem of Fed governance. Before Dodd-Frank, any citizen or politician with a problem within the Fed's regulation of, say, mortgage lending practices under the Truth in Lending Act had to take the fight to the Federal Reserve and its chair. We saw this story earlier in the book. The people, including a member of Federal Reserve Board itself, tried and failed to reform the way the Fed approached sublime mortgage regulation. There was too much else going on the Fed that was seen as much higher priority. In edifice, the I is in the middle of the F, so edifice of Federal Reserve policy, as one politician put it in support of the CFBP. Monetary policy was penthouse, bank supervision, something of afterthought in the middle of the way down to the basement in consumer protection. The relationship between the Fed's jumble governance, the public policy accountability is not theoretical. In the mid-1990s, the Clinton administration approached Lawrence Meyer, a well-regarded economic forecaster and professor of economics at Washington University in St. Louis, about filing a vacancy on the Fed Board of Governors. According to the Meyer, when Clinton's chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, Joseph Stiglitz, called to tell him of the nomination, Stiglitz said he didn't want to pressure me on any issues on behalf of the Clinton administration, but he did want to know what the administration was strongly in favor of. CRA, an acronym that Stiglitz did not define. Meyer reacted with silence. He had never heard of the CRA. Immediately after hanging up, Stiglitz said Meyer, a 65-page history of the Community Revisement Act of Mayer's educational benefit. Meyer proudly noted that not much more a year later, I was named head of the board's oversight committee on consumer and community affairs. I became the member of the board to testify before Congress on issues related to CRA. I went around the country and supported work that community groups and banks were doing in providing affordable housing in low and moderate income groups. In other words, I was CRA all the way. I guess I'm a fast learner. Mayer's anecdote, it's spelled with a C, anecdote, demonstrates the problem of locating too many functions within a single institution. When there is no clear focus among the many, sometimes conflicting missions, and some of these functions will fade into obscurity. A candidate to lead the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau will have opinions on the Community Revisement Act, one of the most important and controversial pieces of consumer financial legislation in U.S. history. But Meyer wasn't a candidate for Fed because of the expertise on consumer affairs. He was a candidate because his prowess as an economic forecaster and reputation as an economist. Despite his plainly acknowledged ignorance, obvious even to administration and had appointed him mayor, became U.S. government's leading consumer financial protection regulator. The creation of separate Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, headed by a Senate confirmed presidential appointee, makes a result like mayors essentially impossible. No one could survive the presidential vetting and Senate confirmation process as the government's enforcers of financial protection laws without knowing what those laws require. The creation of CFPB then is precisely the kind of institutional change that this book's arguments about law, personality, and changes over time would support every 5 years. The President and Senate must convene to discuss publicly about the person we want to execute the government's consumer financial protection laws. This kind of public vetting allows people interested in those laws, either they could find all such laws morally repugnant, they believe consumer financial protection laws should be stricter, or something in between to make their voices heard. The appointment can become a campaign issue. Democracy can weigh in. This was theoretically possible, but much less likely under the Fed's previous organization, given the Fed appointments implicated such a broad range of policy issues. The vice chair for bank supervision. The Dodd-Frank Act innovated in another way that is, to a lesser extent, also to step in a similar direction of simplifying the Fed's governance. The Act creates the position of a vice chairman for bank supervision, who, according to the statute, shall develop policy recommendations for the board regarding supervision and regulation of depository institution, holding companies and other financial firms supervised by the board, and shall oversee the supervision and regulation of such firms. This is the broadest grant of authority to an individual in the Federal Reserve Act, greater than even the explicit authority given to the Fed chair. The creation of the vice chair for supervision signals a potential shift of regulatory duties away from the rest of the Fed to a single individual. The identity of that vice chair will presumably set the tone for the Fed's entire regulatory apparatus, which is significantly under Dodd-Frank. Whether this occurs in practice has yet to be determined, because so many of the Fed's practices are determined in precedent and convention. This identity practices of the first vice chair for supervision will matter. Everything that official does will have ramifications for the way the office is held thereafter. Despite its importance, however, of this writing 5 years after the passage of legislation, the position remains unfilled. Daniel Tarullo, the Fed governor profiled in Chapter 3, has assumed the de facto role of the vice chair of supervision by virtue of his public and private focus on the subject. His role representing the Federal Reserve in interagency and institutional meetings dealing with these issues and his congressional testimonies, but because he has not been nominated and confirmed for the position, and public has not had a chance to weigh in on this singular position in financial regulation, nor do Governor Tarullo's actions carry the same institutional weight that the actions of presidentially appointed Senate confirmed vice chair would have. A formal nomination is long overdue. The statutory purpose would not be fulfilled until the position is formally occupied. In the many areas of appointment failure during the Obama administration, this failure is among the most vexing. Proposals for reform, people, not policies. Next subject, they touched up on this earlier. The work started by Dodd-Frank Act is incomplete. There are still too many diverse functions and policymakers located within the Federal Reserve whose complex relationships make it difficult to provide appropriate intermittent democratic accountability. Through the appointments process, 3 proposals would rather further clarify the Fed's governance structure in ways that would allow more meaningful accountability without compromising the need to keep monetary policy outside the day-to-day of partisan politics. They are first changing the governance structure at the board to eliminate the problems of chair empire building and governor ignorance. Second, increasing the accountability of members of the Fed's senior staff, especially the general counsel, through presidential appointment. And third, reforming the governance of the Federal Reserve banks. Next subject, reforming the Board of Governors. Reforming the Board of Governors does not require changing the statutory vision of a politically accountable Fed chair and a legally powerful and political insulated board of governors. That vision is already in place. We tasked is to improve the institutional design to realize those goals. As discussed in Chapter 8, the problem of the 14-year term of the governors is not that it is too long for the purposes of democratic oversight. It is that the governors resign to the frequently to make them fulfill the statutory intention. At the same time, the chair's ability to serve renewable 4-year terms together with the option of aiding one 14-year term to unfilled term of a predecessor gives the chair opportunity to build a political empire independent of the president. As we saw with the chairman Martin and Greenspan, in both cases, the decisions made toward the end of the tenure have been the flashpoints for the most controversy, just as we recognize the need to change leadership. The presidential level more often than every 20 years, we should seek the same for changes of leadership of the Fed. One way to improve the power and importance of the Board of Governors is for the President and Senate to fill those vacancies. Over the last 50 years, recent trends accelerated during the Obama administration. In Figure 11.1, which has all the presidents: Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan, Bush 1, Clinton, Bush 2, Obama, on a scale from 0 to 90%. Vacancy rates on the Board of Governors, 1960 through 2015 source Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. Chart here. I gotta show the recording first. And I don't know if y'all could really see that shit. But yeah. Shows the trend as we see between the Kennedy and Reagan administrations. Presidents from both parties kept vacancy rates on the 7-person board below 40%. But under the Obama administration, that rate has climbed to an astounding 80%. The blame for the neglect of these appointments lies in part with the Republicans in the Senate. Republicans rejected the nomination of MIT economist Peter Diamond in 2011, arguing that he was unqualified for the job. Diamond is a Nobel laureate and one of the most distinguished economists of his generation. His rejection is inexcusable and may not be the most egregious example of politics over substance in the history of Fed appointments, but Diamond's rejection is unusual. The main problem during the Obama administration is that the president has failed to advance nominees in the first place. More than any other president in his history, President Obama has not made appointments to a Fed a priority. If the Board of Governors is to function as a full committee of presidential representatives overseeing the Fed's many functions, including supervising the reserve banks, future presidents should focus on those vacancies. The appointment process is one of the only ways for the general public through their representatives can influence the Fed and its policies. There is no such restriction on that influence. From large markets participants, presidents should not deprive the Senate and the public of that essential element of public accountability. Filling the board vacancies doesn't do much to stem the high turnover of these who serve on the board, nor does it influence the chair-centric regime that so easily arises within the Fed. A more important approach about to be reconsidered to the governance structure of the board entirely. Both problems that afflict board governance, high turnover and chair domination, could change by increasing the de facto tenure of governors by perhaps counterintuitively decreasing the length of their legal term. Along these lines, one reform would be to give a governor a single non-renewable 10-year term. A governor could also do a longer serve, the balance of the predecessor's term left vacant owing to death or resignation. Each 10-year term would begin anew. When the president appointed by the Senate confirmed a new governor, much like the vacancy filing process in the federal judiciary to fulfill the Federal Reserve Act's intent to limit vacancies during the presidential term, the board could also be shrunk to 5 governors, a change that would bring the Fed into line with other federal agencies. The new result, 5 governors serving 10-year terms with the vacancies arising either organically because sitting governors resign early or at a predictable 2-year interval. At the appointment process, the public could evaluate the appointments as they come due, mostly one at a time, in a public vetting process that is, as the Supreme Court said, among the sufficient structural safeguards of the constitutional scheme to limit the chair undue influence in sustaining a multi-decade appointment. Under this proposal, the chair's terms would be for 5 years, renewable exactly once. If the president chooses as a chair sitting governor, the term would be limited. When it is time to renew or not the appointment of the Fed chair, the president must determine whether the continued service of the board of governor demoted from chair would be consistent with the president's political and policy goals. We saw what happened with President Truman. In a similar dynamic, the Mariner S-list, no matter how popular the chair, though, once the 10-year term ends, so ends the chair service, and chair would continue to serve as at the pleasure of the president, as argued above. His dismissal, like the dismissal of others appointed to their posts, exercise technocratic judgments, would be under political considerations, not legal ones. Whether a tradition would arise that every chair gets a full 10 years would be a future resolution. The result of a 5-year person board of governors led by public-facing term limited chair would go rather to make the promise of the Federal Reserve Act a reality as it currently exists. The potential for and reality of governor irrelevance and chair domination gets the necessary balance between insulation and accountability exactly backward. Fed staff presidential appointments. Chapter 4 explored the influence the Fed staff, especially senior economists and the General Counsel, can have on Fed policy. The question for a governance-based approach to Fed reform is whether the staff is exercising the kind of values-oriented judgment that should demand greater democratic accountability, or whether those roles are strictly technocratic and therefore better placed at a remove from partisan politics. There is no single answer for all the heads of the Fed 15 divisions. Before Dodd-Frank, there was a much stronger case that the head of division of bank supervision and regulation should be given a public vetting through the presidential appointment process. The presidential appointment of the vice chair of supervision makes the question mostly moot. The question for the 3 economists, sometimes called the 3 barons, the head of research in statistics, monetary affairs, and international finance, is different and harder. The heads of the research, statistics, and monetary affairs have the best claim that theirs is a more strictly technocratic role, that public input on their selection is unlikely to help, and indeed likely to hurt the chances of the most skilled economists researching those positions. But as this book has argued at length, even with the technical questions required to exercise extraordinary value judgments, the wisdom of, say, quantitative easing and maintaining a policy of zero interest rates cannot be resolved by resort to objective standards of economic science. Having a say in the selection of those who supervise the production of the Fed's economic models and empirical data may be an appropriate and limited way for the public to participate in the identification of those values. As Alan Blinder has put it in an interview about the role of the Fed's senior economist, I don't know how much of the interesting question in economic or social policy to which there is only one clear answer. Perhaps it's appropriate to reevaluate the appointment process for those policymakers within the Fed to assure that the, quote, increasing questions on economic and social policy are debated. At the very least, it would be a valuable debate to have. Moving further along the spectrum, the role of the director of the International Finance Division, there is much in the position that is technical. But as seen in the case of Edwin Truman, there is much too that is highly diplomatic. If the head of the International Finance is essentially the Fed's chief diplomat, presidential appointment is much more desirable. The Fed's role as the international economy has increased substantially in the last 30 years, as Truman himself has documented in detail. The argument for the presidential appointment for his key position is stronger than the other two division heads, representing the United States government and delicate diplomatic affairs is quintessentially executive function, usually subject to presidential appointment and Senate confirmation. Again, at the very least, this is a debate worth having. The strongest argument for presidential appointment among the Fed staff is in the position of general counsel. The Fed's chief lawyer, is discussed in Chapter 4, exercises his extraordinary authority both in times of crisis to justify and legitimate the Fed's crisis policies, but also in shaping the Fed's entire regulatory and supervisory apparatus. Again, one of the book's central themes is that the laws governing the Federal Reserve are complex and require not just the technical skills of lawyers to interpret, but also invite value judgments. The position of the Fed's general counsel and the lawyers be supervises requires value judgments informed by technical expertise. These functions should not be made politicians in campaign commercials, but the case for allowing the public to vet the appointment of the chief lawyer is very strong. 2 points of comparison are useful in a discussion on the appointment status of the Fed's chief lawyer. First, unlike the case, the other barons of the Fed staff, the Fed's Board of Governors is not a position of exercise significant oversight over the Fed's chief lawyer. As discussed above, the Fed's, including the board, had become increasingly dominated by economists. A transition away from the tradition of bankers and lawyers. There are good reasons for this transition. One consequence, however, is that the Fed is not well equipped to push back against lawyers or even understand the value judgments that a lawyer must make with a regularity couched as they are in the arcane apparatus of legal analysis. This failure of supervision is not the board's fault, but it is a consequence of their different comparative expertise. As of this writing, there are 2 lawyers on the Fed's board, but only one has spent a significant portion of his career dealing with the legal issues relevant to the Fed's regulatory work. Second, while the most general counsels at administrative agencies are not presidential appointments, the Fed's chief lawyer makes judgments of extraordinary importance that are unlikely ever to be reviewed by a court. Courts have made clear for 80 years that they will not review the Fed's discussions about monetary policy, including when those decisions require novel interpretations of law. And in the crisis, the Fed made emergency decisions that have been effectively removed from judicial review, despite potential violations of state corporate law and even the Constitution. While courts do review many of the Fed's regulatory determinations in places where the value judgments are the most consequence, the Fed's lawyer in the first and last word on what the law allows or forbids. Avoiding judicial review may be a feature, not a bug. The idea of protracted litigation trying up emergency lending or monetary policy changes is not a good one, but that only shifts the need to be more transparent with respect to the appointments of those lawyers who will fulfill this monitoring role. For this reason, the Fed's chief lawyer should be a presidential appointment without democratic oversight at the appointment level. Many of the most important value judgments the Fed's lawyers make will never receive that review. The section title above ends in the question mark. There are perhaps arguments that the extension of presidential appointment and Senate confirmation into the organization would be destabilizing to the Fed's internal operations. Very likely those opposed to these ideas would say that the Fed's independence, quote, would be compromised by increased political oversight. If they have read this far, hopefully they see how little weight the concept of Fed independence can bear on asking these kinds of questions about internal governance, but there may be arguments in favor of insulating the barons. including the General Counsel, from more public scrutiny at the very least. This is a debate that the Fed reformers should engage. Reforming the Federal Reserve Banks. That leaves the reserve banks. They argued throughout this book the reserve banks, and given its location, perhaps especially the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, have the potential to make policy and constitutional trouble for the rest of the system. Reforming the Federal Reserve Banks by revisiting the question of the appointment of their leaders should be the top priority of anyone who wants the system to conform to the constitutional requirements and to allow meaningful democratic accountability without compromising the benefits of an institutionally distinct central bank. There are 4 alternatives for addressing the problem of the reserve banks: problematic and arguably unconstitutional governance. First, give the Board of Governors the authority to fire at will the heads of the reserve banks. Satisfying the constitutional requirement is articulated by the U.S. Supreme Court, but still appoint them largely by their private boards. Second, make the U.S. President and the Senate responsible for appointing and confirming the Reserve Bank presidents under the Constitution's Appointments Clause. Third, single out the President of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York for a Senate-confirmed appointment. Fourth and last, make the Board of Governors responsible for both appointing and firing the Reserve Bank presidents, taking private bankers out of their business of the Federal Reserve governance, but without extending unnecessary and duplicative political appointments throughout the system. Let's take each proposal in turn. First, leave the appointment system in place, but change the way that the Reserve Bank president is removed. This appears to be the institutional fix favored by the Supreme Court, as discussed in Chapter 5. The court in the 2010 case Free Enterprise Fund vs. PCAOB held that the Constitution permits restrictions on the president's ability to fire his subordinates only one level into the bureaucracy, applying the court's reasoning to the Fed. This would mean that restricting the president's ability to fire members of the Board of Governors is permissible, but limiting the governor's ability to remove at will the Reserve Bank's presidents is not. The court's solution in Free Enterprise Fund wasn't to invalidate the entire structure of the subordinate agency, but to eliminate from the statute the offending removal procedure. In Free Enterprise Fund, that meant that the members of the Securities and Exchange Commission could remove at will the members of the subordinate Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, PCAOB, but the PCAOB still continued to perform its statutory functions. In the Fed's case, that would mean that the reserve banks would continue to exist in their current role. It would just mean that the board governors wouldn't be able to fire any officer for any or no reason. If the FOMC removability issue were ever litigated to conclusion, we might expect a similar treatment. The members of the FOMC not appointed by the president would be rendered removable at will by the Board of Governors, just as the governors supervise the reserve banks and every other aspect of the Fed's wide regulatory berth. While this judicial fix satisfies the Supreme Court requirements, it is not satisfying result. In terms of the theory of democratic government,